Good morning. My name is Mark Perkins. I'm with Boon, Edam, and I'm presenting session CS5 this morning. Obviously, we have a small group, so it makes sense to just jump in, ask questions anywhere through it. If we had a really large group, I would carve out time, different places throughout the presentation, but it's a small group, so let's just make this useful. Thanks for coming. This is surprise. It's a flash mob. One of the challenges with even naming this event is this isn't the true definition of a flash mob. Flash mob was originally a social media phenomenon used to create some sort of artistic expression. The actual definition of what, in the dictionary, of what has occurred is called a bum rush. I just don't recommend using it. It's just not very politically correct. So I think at different points in this presentation, we've coined the phrase smart mob rather than a flash mob. Now, I don't want to insinuate it's smart, but I think it's perhaps a term that has some merit. So the study today was on Wells Fargo Bank, and it was I've had several clients that have experienced the smart mob phenomenon. It typically occurs, obviously, in downtown areas where there are public gathering places near. If you visit downtown Detroit, for example, your Quick and Loan, Rock Financial people have about 40 buildings in the downtown Detroit area. And there's a public square that's kind of in the middle of many of these buildings, and there are events that take place all the time. And as a result, their buildings, on occasion, they'll have a major incident at one of their buildings. They probably don't get covered very well in the press. Maybe it's just because it's Detroit and they expect that. But as far as Wells Fargo Bank, that did make the press. And do you need me to just speak louder, or you okay?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. So, making business decisions based on popular issues or populist movements without any suitable perception by management can put your brand at risk. Executives at the Wells Fargo Tower in downtown Minneapolis discovered firsthand how the combination of popular public perception and ineffective security infrastructure can lead to a well-executed smart mob. Did anybody see in the news the gold nugget stolen from the headquarters building in San Francisco? Yeah, you did, I imagine. So this group of security professionals just last year suffered several, the company is struggling, but they suffered, the security groups suffered a couple big hits. One was an SUV that drove down one of the hillier streets in San Francisco and drove right through the side of the museum where they keep their treasures. And the two geniuses that did this jumped out of their SUV, which didn't stop till it made it almost to the elevator bank, and they stole the gold nugget. It was the size of a 7 to 12 pound rock. Of course, it was fake gold. It was just a painted rock. They left all the valuable things in the display cases next to it, valuable coins. The good thing is they didn't hit the Wells Fargo wagon, which is extremely valuable. It's great that they didn't hit that. So they suffered a couple things. And so this year, having the towers overrun in Minneapolis was a big deal to this group. It was reported in the paper, and I'd like to stick to using the news in terms of reporting it. That really It started at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and it didn't end until afternoon. And they really overran the whole downstairs floor of the building in protest against the financing of the pipeline up in the Dakotas. So it was the real challenges we'll talk about as we get into this is there are certain times of the day in a very busy downtown area, especially like New York, it would be very hard to use any kind of smart city analytics that we all talk about and hope that are coming to foresee a change in pattern or movement because you've got so many people entering the towers to go to work at that time of day. So it appears to me that this was a fairly smart group, and they, hence the smart mob, they gave them the title. And I think it had to do with their understanding of maybe what kind of surveillance did exist already at that particular site. It was a newer building. I know that I put equipment in less than 10 months prior to this incident, and so it was, it was a brand new building. So what was the first thing the public relations people did? I think if you read from the news, it says that Wells Fargo sent them a letter on social media. It said that they would be willing to meet with a select group of tribal elders to discuss their concerns with Wells Fargo investment in the Dakota Access Pipeline prior to January 2017. Upon receiving that letter at a little bit after noon, they all just sort of picked up their toys and went home. So it's just a really bizarre incident. What was really odd about it, I think, is that the police would not remove the people. Yes?
That was my question. Where were they protesting? In a public space or in a private?
They took over the whole bottom floor of one of the towers.
Is that public space or not?
It is.
Okay.
It is. And the elevator banks are closed off. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, not public space.
So it's Wells Fargo space?
It's their space.
Okay. All right.
Yep. And it was interesting that they weren't removed. There were a couple people that were minor employees that were hurt, which is obviously never a good thing. But the funny thing is, do you guys think this was the right thing to do? Just off the top of your head?
I think that's a reasonable approach to, I think that's a reasonable approach to getting the folks out of there. It certainly would be a lot higher on my list than trying to forcibly do something there, because you know what happens in those cases, right?
Good, sure. And I guess it depends on the show of force, right?
It's pretty hard to undo something after it's already there. You know, speaking from a police officer standpoint, when you have a group like that that comes in and they're going to make a point, so then it's a hard decision as to, from Wells Fargo standpoint, okay, how much am I willing to push this? If you're talking about removing people, well, you don't know what their reaction is going to be, so you don't know how physical that has to get. And then that creates worse publicity than what you had to begin with.
It's all on social media.
Yeah, so, you know, I think they were in a no-win situation.
Absolutely.
At that point, so doing what they did was probably the best way to handle it.
I think the discussion about a flash mob or this incident, it goes bigger than maybe just my level of expertise, that's for sure. But I don't want to not lay out the two paths that existed at the time and the preparation from each path. And since I'm not Wells Fargo, and even if I can't speak to every one of these issues, but it goes without saying that we need to put them out there in terms of discussing the whole issue. Maybe as we get to the end and I've addressed the physical building design issues that were changed, which I am qualified to talk about, maybe there's some people in the room that could chime in on other aspects of this. But we know on the IT side, that if they weren't doing it, they should have perhaps been doing some sort of social analyzer. They should have been monitoring media, so they would have known there's a huge perhaps risk being created by branding yourself. You could finance the pipeline without branding yourself to the pipeline, and they didn't choose to do it. So it was could have been intentional. I really don't know. But I do know that monitoring the media would have been important. Obviously, monitoring events in the city is important. I would assume they do some of that. And as I think more smart city applications come online, I think it'll be easier for companies to access usable data. And I also think that the IT folks were very siloed. Were they sharing with the physical security guys? My understanding is not so much. So I think the security professionals, it was a brand new building, so I'm assuming there was a coup plan put in place. And I'm assuming perhaps it did, or perhaps it didn't include what to do with a smart mob. Based on how they handled it, and it taking over 4 hours to pen the letter, perhaps there wasn't that amount of consideration taken into the idea that the building could be overrun by protesters. But I'm sure the coup planning included all other pertinent things. As far as the coup planning having any kind of mass notification, I don't mean that in terms of the right system, at the right decibel, I don't mean just technically, I mean was there in place a way to use the same tools that were used against them to help them through this process, whether it was to notify their people via text, via Facebook, via email. Those are the things that I've watched some of my other clients do in these instances, is to redirect. They'll even put out faults to redirect the mob to a different location. You use the same tool against them. Now this was a smart mob, so that might not have worked. Couldn't resist. So obviously, I've gotten to know a lot about the group. They started using the security professionals like you guys more and more. I don't know that it was directly related to this incident as it is all of the technology change, but they have been doing more and more third-party assessments. The reason they've been doing them is they haven't really been consistently applying the assessments across their enterprise. And that was shared with me, and I think that would help them a lot. They do, when you look at the building slides that I'm going to move towards, they do mix technology with manpower and workforce education. Those three they do pretty well. They obviously didn't do that mix to prepare for this event. And hence that meant a redesign of the building and redeployment of new technology. The one thing I can tell you is that the discussions that ensued were discussions that we've been having with Wells Fargo on a regular basis for the last really 7 years, is where do you deploy tailgating detection, which would be an optical turnstile array in a lobby, or where do you put in full height barriers, security revolving doors, which is a tailgating prevention strategy. One of the things that I found, and if anybody has a comment on this, I'd like to, because as I said, this is not my area of expertise, but I pulled this slide from this company as one of the companies I could have chosen to say, here's some of the tools you could use to analyze any kind of social media event like this. And I pulled it because I was astounded by the numbers. Under population, internet users, active social media. This company, this is their slide, it's their trademark slide, and it's the numbers that they put out. Does anybody dispute these numbers or have anything? So I certainly did, and I thought that this company would be a great counterpart presenter to this group about this subject, and would probably bring a lot more interest than just the physical aspects of redesigning the building on the lower level. But nonetheless, I wanted to put this out there, and if anybody gets to a point where they'd like to throw out a couple other companies that they feel does this well for the group, I think that would be helpful to the small group. Does anybody else know any other good social analyzer companies or products out there that they've seen deployed?
There are a bunch of them out there. One of the things now is the NBA has mandated that arenas conduct social media monitoring to make sure that no problems translate to the arenas.
When did that happen?
This year.
Do you think that'll transfer to other large corporate venues?
The sports leagues tend to follow each other. The sports leagues tend to follow each other, so I would imagine that all of them, if they're not already, will be doing social media monitoring.
Yeah, and what surprised me is, in the Rock Financial Quicken Loan Group downtown Detroit, they own the Cavaliers. So it's not like they're not aware that, so you would think that a lot of corporations that have holdings in downtown areas will start utilizing the same thing, or a company like this.
We're also advising all of our clients to include this in their threat management programs.
Excellent. So a quick look, and I didn't want to pull up full drawings on a building, so I just took a quick snapshot. So the exterior of each tower actually has 4 regular manual revolving doors, one up on this north side of the building, then the east down on the bottom. And you enter through the revolving doors into that area. That's where the protesters entered through. They just all poured through the revolving doors into the area. And then as we move to the left in the other illustrations I have, you move towards the elevator banks where the protest was staged in a big way. They had manual revolving doors. I know Jim Henry did a session yesterday, as only Jim could do, and talked about contractors, how they interfere with specs, and how Division 8 and Division 28 don't end up merging, and no matter how you try, you don't end up with what you want. That's what happened here. It just seemed like it was an impossible task, even through utilizing the security group of Wells Fargo, to be able to get something other than just manual revolving doors, which if you want to lock, you get down on your hands and knees, you clean out the hole in the floor where the stuff is debris, and you throw a lock into the floor, then you line up the other wing and do the same thing. Now, I love revolving doors, but not that much. So that's what's on the envelope of both of the towers. If you look what they did in terms of the original building design and what we installed, on the bottom left, I use that illustration because I wanted to point out there were 10 elevator banks in each tower. And so you had a penned-in area with optical turnstiles. As you can see, the infrastructure for monitoring was good. You can see a lot of the things were good on the project. It was a newer building, and they did a fairly good job at their access, their visitor management, their VMS, pulling that all together. Did a good enough job to see clearly what happened that day, but not to prevent the social media smart mob. So up in the right is just an illustration that just shows you the guard desk. And again, it's my way of trying to retain some level of anonymity for the building, but that's exactly what was there the day of the incident. So that will give you an illustration from the lower level. At each of those pedestals areas, you had your elevator banks that go back, and you had guards posted at the elevator banks, as well as the officers' area over to the right that we saw in the last drawing. So what happened after the event? They went through the optical turnstiles. Once they're open, they just, they're really didn't have to do a whole lot of hopping over. That was on the film. So they just sort of took over this whole area inside and on the outside of this area and wouldn't let employees come or go, and some employees were trapped during the incident, and as I said, a couple were injured, minor injuries. So the process that always goes into place at a company is a methodology that we refer to as STARTS. And STARTS is an interesting methodology. Some of you might have seen it before. We've used it for several years, and we use it with large clients. And STARTS is a way to start a discussion with a client. What is important to you? And so as a consultant, using a STARTS methodology tool, it's a great tool. It's so simple, but it basically puts out in front of them all the things that might matter to their client when taking into consideration how they're going to put barriers in place in a building. And so culture always wins the day in some way, and then real life experience reforms the culture. And that's what happened in this case. But for the most part, it's a dichotomy to us. And I know, Kurt, you and I have talked before that we have one of those products that money is spent for one reason, and then we're evaluated on a completely unrelated criteria. And for cameras, you buy cameras, they're evaluated, and the spend is for what they do. Visitor management, those are all the same. When you get to barrier products, the spend you think is for security, but the truth is, typically safety and throughput win the day. They have to. Hence, you hear all the conversations about frictionless designs. And so throughput and safety must carry the day, but that's not why they spend the money. So you're evaluated after you do your deal on throughput and safety, but the spend was for security. So what happens is you start out the conversation and you have all these various parties, whether it's human resources, whether it's the security group, the facilities group, the executive group, all of these STARTS areas get evaluated for some level of importance to them. And then after the installation, I can guarantee you it changes. So this is what happened after this incident. That's where we were before the incident. So you can see that there's definitely an emotional reaction to any incident, even if it's not life-threatening. If it affects the brand, there's a huge swing. And this is what happened on this particular project. Any questions on this? One of the things, I'm going to jump to the physical barrier design options. One of the things they looked at, that was the original one that I showed you earlier. And then they did consider this because it was fairly inexpensive to make the change where you could just they added an 8-foot barrier wall and just added some higher turnstile barriers. But when looking at the film from the event, you'll notice that most of the people just walk through the optical turnstiles. Well, it's no different than a card reader on a swing door, except for it'll beep. Once they're open, you're as vulnerable as you were. And just for the record, even an old guy like me can climb over those and get to the other side to this very day, uninjured and it's very impressive. So the point is, they did consider just updating what they had, and when it was all said and done, the prevention strategy versus detection strategy is what won the day. So what they did put in was the same design you just saw, but they used security revolving doors. And one of the reasons they did is obviously because it prevents what happened. It would have kept the incident in space that did not affect the employees coming up or down the elevator bank, since there was no way to notify them. And with 10 banks going, it's just, it's a difficult, it's just a difficult situation to manage. But they wanted to push the event out further, even if it's in the building. They also made an attempt, which we'll look at, to fragment the group, to divide the group, and we'll see that. So 10 months after installing the first ones, I know I was the lucky recipient of tearing all those out and putting in this new design. Not circumstances in which nobody likes to fortune off someone else's misfortune, but that's exactly what happened. So that's what it looked like when it was all done, and what it looks like today at both towers. So you still have your guard desk over to the right, and you have your unguarded area into the elevator banks.
What do they do to the perimeter?
I'm going right behind you.
Mark,
Yes, sir.
can you discuss a little bit, perhaps, this group, about the use of the revolver? I noticed they only had 3 revolving doors, but you had more full-height optical lanes in the building. How does that work with throughput of people? Because it seems like you're choking it down, right? At least that would be the perception.
Well, those were studies we did, which was great because it was a new building. We had great reader reports. We had great ability to assess whether or not we'd be choking this down. But in essence, each revolving door, it's two-way traffic at the same time. So the truth is, when somebody asks me what's the throughput on your products, whatever the design is, I will always outline it as 8 a.m. in the morning, lunchtime, going home. There's no way to just say, oh, it does 40 people per minute. The truth is, an optical turnstile is both directions, but one at a time. So at lunchtime, throughput at each lane of an optical turnstile drops significantly. Unless you over-engineer and put in way more lanes than you actually need. Then you measure the efficiency rating of each unit and say, I'm utilizing this optical turnstile at 15%. I'm not even using it. So you can over-engineer, or if you spend prudently, you're looking at, in a peak 10-minute period, each one of these doors on average will process 180 people, so about 18 people per minute. So it was determined that the revolving door layout that we proposed was probably double what they needed.
You don't mind me asking, what kind of glass did you use?
It's a great question. It was a Lamy. And we've been listening to some of the other sessions, the one on Sandy Hook Elementary, I believe it was. I like the idea of using a tempered with a coating on it to hold it in place. And Kurt and I are currently working on a project to launch what we call vandal-rated doors. Europe has a vandalism rating for doors based on whether you use a hammer, a sledgehammer, a screwdriver. I mean, it's kind of humorous, but it is a standard. And so we were looking this year at introducing these standards to the U.S. for both vandalism and for BR. BR is a little more challenging. We currently do BR security revolving doors. We have one client in Atlanta that has an entire campus that has 40 or 50 units on the campus. And it's an interesting design, which if we have time at the end, I'd be happy to go back to that. But does that answer your question?
Yes.
Well, it's a great question. It's coming up all the time now. On the outside of the building, all of those manual revolving doors, they brought power to them. And we turned them into power assist manual revolving doors. So you go up, just touch them, they just float and turn, and they always stop and rest in what we call the X position that you see where the doors are sitting down. And that was great because that meant I could remotely lock them And I could use sensors in the ceiling to make sure I didn't entrap, and I could finish a transaction to whatever degree, and then the doors could lock. Or, Kurt is really good at this, you could just lock the door where they're at. Either way. But the bottom line is the perimeter of the building was, you were able with one execution, you were able to lock the entire perimeter of the building. Now, that doesn't mean that someone won't go back and panic out one of the swing doors next to it. The only thing that you could, that they didn't originally do, it was a smoke detected and sprinkler building. So they put in a 15-second delay panic on the swing door. And it gives them enough time to,
Here, so, I'm just curious about exit width, and I can't imagine in a building like this, a fire inspector that I might be dealing with allowing me, number one, to put for this size building, I'm sure at least there is a stairwell that exits the building that comes through the lobby.
Correct.
And there's another one or more that go out directly, but the fact that one of them comes down through the building, hits the lobby, and then you've got the population of square feet in the lobby, it's hard to believe that the fire marshal would allow you to have as few as 2 swing doors, let alone put a delay on them. And that's, it's an interesting conundrum that we all have. I'm not suggesting that there's wrong but I think it's an architectural challenge. I think we have architectural challenges there.
so I'd have to say that based on the 2 doors on the north side and the single door on the east side, that met your egress requirement for that area of the building. There's other stairwells that dump other people out different ways, and it's not to say that somebody wouldn't pull a fire alarm, which would override all of these. As I said, it's a smart mount, so there are things that they could figure out to do, but it did give them more time. It did give them a chance to divide the group, some on the outside, slowing them down, and perhaps then execute a strategy that would help.
Did they address the employee issue? In other words, I don't know why they would have the employees coming in the same door up front where the patrons would, be coming in as well. Obviously the employees got hurt during that altercation. Did they alter that so that they were coming in a more secure way, so they didn't have to worry about that happening again with their employees?
So those were the employee entrances. This is a big city building, and it's a public access, as Jim pointed out, but not a public building. So if they had banking services attached to it, it would have its own entrance. And if they had I have some other buildings that I'm working on with them that have Starbucks and gift shops or other things like that. They have their own, those are different challenges on what to do with the first floor, and then the employee entry piece is a little different.
Right.
But these were the entrances for the employees.
So that was the only way they had to come in.
And there's 2 towers identical, so this just occurred in one of the towers, but they were identical towers. So you did manage to find a way to slow down on the outside, just to tour, maybe give yourself a little advantage, maybe just by making it more challenging. If they'd have looked and saw the security revolving doors on the inside, they would have chosen to do the same thing, but in a different way. It might have been outside in front of the building. It's hard to say, but the changes made it a little more challenging to execute this type of event on this building. And I'm assuming it would be very embarrassing to happen a second time. I'm just assuming. So the other considerations, and look, some of this is obvious, but when you sit down with the client and you start talking about levels of barriers, sometimes it's just good to lay it out in a picture and say, look, you have crowd control types of devices that require quite a bit of annual operating costs in order to manage with people a process that has devices that don't detect or prevent somebody from answering. They just sort of detour a little bit. In the full height turnstile, which are normal perimeter devices, they don't break away. There are the reasons why they're difficult to deploy in the inside of a building, and they don't look great. There are some buildings that you might want those in, but most office buildings, it's just not the look. But it does make it, it is a deterrent, it does slow things down. But there's no detection, and there's a little bit of prevention in that no two of us are going to want to cram in and go through any one turnstile rotation together, but you can do it. I've seen it done. When you get to optical turnstiles, they're great. They do a great job at detecting, and combined with good manpower, it's a very effective tool. And I think that's very common in a lot of buildings where it makes sense to use the manpower at the lobby. It makes sense to design the lobby that way. When you get to the prevention strategy products, which are the security revolving door or our man-trap product group, the capital cost between putting in opticals or putting in revolvers is the same. I mean, if you do the math, one installs a lot easier than the other, meaning there's less disruptive work. When you have to core drill and put in conduits through floors, and you have, it's easier to do ceiling work than it is to do floor work. And so one is a simpler execution, but in the end, they both cost about the same. I think the difference is that you get very little annual operating cost associated with deploying that strategy. And so the payback on these, if you look at, Citi publishes it, so I'm not, theirs is 5 years. I know Wells Fargo depreciates the doors over 7 years. I have a couple other clients, one that does 10, one that does 15, just simply because that was what they use for manual doors, and just said, well, we don't know what the difference is at the accounting level, so it's 15. Obviously, if you depreciate over 15, the payback's about 1 month. If you depreciate over 5 years, the payback for a unit is 5 to 6 months. If you look at the cash return, just getting your cash back, in all cases, it's under 2 years, and you have all your money back on a cash basis. So it's a strong incentive to go that way if it's presented accurately. The one thing that we do a little bit better is there are some metrics capabilities. In other words, there is some analytics that you get with the prevention products. And we don't do a very good job yet of two things. One, teaching you that that exists and marketing that. And two, having a user interface to that data that's really easy and really convenient, because most of the discussions this week were about should you connect up to these entrances and put them on your network. Are you going to make them edge devices, and are the barrier companies stepping up and putting in place the right security in their systems to allow that to happen? The answer is they haven't yet. But you can interpolate, and Kurt and I will go in and, excuse me, we will go ahead and do an analysis for a customer. We'll go ahead and pull the data from the door. And we'll come back and we'll tell them that your door, it has X% of rejections. And then we'll analyze what those rejections are made up of. And then we'll reapply sampling levels to the door to weed out those rejections, and only retain the ones as much as you possibly can that you want rejected for behavior or reasons that's just not acceptable, like two people. You can use the door in another way. You could, the same sampling rates that determine what's happening in the door, it does some predictive indexing, predictive analysis. The door does come back and say, look, this is my weakness. There's about a 2.68% chance that somebody, if they knew how, could sneak through this door. So the door does give the client feedback. So with Wells Fargo, it's a real easy discussion. You know whatever you buy, regardless of what you buy, you know it's not going to be 100%. And they'll all sit there and say, yes, we know that. So do you want to know the loan number? And do you want to pull that loan number over time to see if people have adapted to the measures that you put in place? And I think that's where we have to evolve and do a better job as entrance companies. And the reason I haven't spent a whole bunch of time in that area is it becomes too product-centric for this venue. And if there are any of you folks that are interested in understanding how we do the predictive analytics in the door and how the customer can pull the data and what kind of reporting we provide to help them determine what sampling rates and sampling levels to set within their product, that's what the enterprise group does at Boon with our large clients. And we've had some really good large clients across the enterprise that have helped us learn how to do this really, really well. What you'll see in the future from us will be better predictive analytics, but the interface for the client, that's the weakness. And that's the weakness for all of the barrier companies, not just Boon. And I think that's where we have to grow up and grow with this whole industry. And I knew that coming to this event, but this event was an explanation point on the fact that we do some predictive analytics and we do it well. We just have no way to make it easy for the client to use that. So hopefully in the future, Kurt has developed a way in which we'll push that data up through the access control. And that would be a great starting point, because that network, that secured network already exists, and hopefully that's something that we can work out. Your head's turning.
Go back to the slide that shows the revolving doors. One more, I think. So I just have a comment. When we've done some various things, it seems like this is a broken architectural promise. Not on your side, not on this system, but on, if you look at the ceiling, look at the space, look at what they're doing. There was an architect involved when they designed the building that envisioned a lobby and did a ceiling based on that and everything else. And none of this matches. It's like a thing in the middle. And when we were down, we get this all the time, right? Because when we're putting in something that's a lower barrier, they want it as low as possible. They want it to go away and hide and all that sort of thing, right? And so that's been one of the things, the low barrier and the turnstiles and whatever. And then as it goes up to here, and it gives you a better structural barrier, which I've done a lot of revolving doors, then it's almost like it's architecturally broken, I guess is that. It doesn't have architectural integrity. That's what the architect's going to say, right, to you. And
It's not his idea, it has no architectural integrity.
So if they were to have this structurally, this vision going in, and now you're doing a lot of work with Wells, so as they do their next buildings, if they were to get involved with the architect with this concept at the very beginning, you might be able to make it more integrated into the building, into the ceiling, into the, the whole vision of how the building comes together, and I bet you it would play even better.
Agreed. Now, one of the things that we don't talk a lot about as security people is the fact that because it had revolving doors on the skin of the building, let's just say the stack pressure, the air handling system was designed with a certain level of filtration from the first floor, and considering the convection at the elevator banks being in both towers where they're at, you're gonna, there's a lot of makeup there. So putting in another layer of revolving doors would have changed the dynamics within that system in the building. So part of the discussion was going up how high and leaving the top open. But I have buildings downtown Phoenix in brass, just like this, and all in brass, matching all the architecture of the building. I think you'd be hard pressed to walk in that building and say this wasn't here when the building was designed. It looks beautiful. Beauty is obviously in the eye of the architect. I was going to say the beholder, but the truth is, I didn't want to put real photos up. I didn't want to have the company's name in it. I just didn't want to go there, but it looks really good. And the executive group is very pleased with it. You're retrofitting.
If you have the opportunity to do it up front, then you do it. Aesthetically pleasing, and all of those good things. In a retrofit, you make the best of what you got.
Can we say something further?
Is that the actual, it's a rendering, obviously, but the colors and all, is that correct? That's what it was called.
Correct.
I think Mark, it's a hand rubbed oil finish on months. So that, obviously kind of brown and whatever, but when you get there, you see the richness of
Yeah, it looks brown.
you see the richness of the true hand rub months finish on it. So the optical lens that were previously were a hand rubbed oil finish as well. A nice rich look to it.
Was there any feedback from the employees, I'm like perceiving an employee saying, I feel like I work in a jail now, where I'm seeing all these security measures coming in, do I work in a county prison now, or what? Was there any feedback there, negative?
Yeah, so the question is, how did the employees react, and was there significant or any feedback to putting these measures in place? Wells Fargo has security revolving doors look just like the ones on the front of the building. They're glass, they're aluminum. Most people, you could go through one if it was in a manual mode, and you wouldn't know you were going through a security revolving door. So I don't think people, especially places like New York, I don't think people look at a revolving door like a prison. I can tell you that 7 years ago, in retrofitting campuses for their company, there was negative feedback to putting in the revolving doors. I can tell you that there was formal complaints filed last year in Des Moines, Iowa, by employees who were forced to move into a mortgage building and did not have them. That was the formal complaints. So it's switched, and it's switched in their culture. The people in this building are nothing short of thrilled that they have a revolving door to go through that gives them some level of protection. And I guess, it just depends on the culture of the client.
I know in the public sector, I do a lot of work on subway systems and stuff like that, and when you mess with people's train of travel, it's not pretty. That's why I was thinking, okay, now I got to go through another set of doors. That's my world. People get bent out of shape when you mess with their mode of travel.
And we've done so much work over there historically with the New York Transit Authority and the Toronto Transit Authority, Chicago Transit Authority. I know what you mean. Our equipment takes an absolute whooping when it goes in. And that's just part of it. But I think, now, a good example, General Motors, Ford, really the American auto industry, they use the full-height turnstiles a lot at entrances to plants. But Honda of America and some of your APAC or some of your German they all use the security revolving doors at their plants. So I have doors at some of the plants in Ohio that have been in for over 10 years. I have some that put on, a year, 20 million cycles. And so you got shifts pouring out, but it was completely unacceptable for somebody to enter one of those buildings where they manufacture cars and not being employed there. So the revolving doors are extremely, we've been using them for years. It's a well thought out product. It's very, very robust. So I wouldn't even have a problem putting a security revolving door with the right glass set. I wouldn't have a problem putting it in a transit. It's going to get beat to daylights, but it's not going to look as pretty as the day it went in. But I would be comfortable with that based on how I've seen it utilized in some manufacturing plants.
You ever been on New York City subway system?
So the question is, have I ever lived to tell my adventures on a New York City subway station? Yes. This wouldn't work. So any questions about this particular concept of having a discussion with your client in terms of, do you want to prevent, do you want to analyze whether or not what you chose to do was accomplishing what you set out to do? And that's really been the biggest and best, the biggest surprise to me over the years was it was okay to spend $500,000 to put in all this stuff in my lobby, and in the end, I don't really have to say or prove what I accomplished or what I did or didn't get out of doing it. It was an improvement, and that was a good enough reason to spend it. I don't think it works that way anymore. I think over time, our products are going to have to evaluate the job they're doing and give that feedback to the security professionals. And that's how we'll sell a lot more product, and that's how we would become a credible partner to the group at this type of venue. So I'm coming to the end of mine. You want to do all these things. And that would be it. Any questions, any discussions you want to have about I've talked about what you do to react after, or what you would do if you had a building that suffered this event and you wanted to secure it. So mine was a reactive measure. I'm not an expert enough to talk about what to do as a preventive measure. I have some common sense about it, and I have a lot of bits and pieces of the information. Does anybody want to carry the conversation, more towards the analytics piece?
Did they have any intelligence at all that there was going to be a protest?
So the question is, did they have any intelligence that they saw after looking back, or that they saw prior?
Did they have it prior and not properly react, or work to minimize or mitigate the situation? Did they have any information at all? Like, did the security guards even see a crowd start gathering out in front? I mean, to what degree did they have any ability to intervene or to corral before it wound up being that huge problem?
They were not Johnny on the spot. I think it's security guards that are posted that deep into the building and that are not, up near the entry areas of the building. By the time, it was just on them. And I think that's the thing about a smart mob, is that if it's well executed, and I've seen them, they're really good at it. I don't really know what you can do other than lock it down. Maybe that divides some of them. It doesn't go the way they thought it planned. Then you've got another barrier set to get through. And by the time you're done, you're pretty compartmentalized in terms of how you're going to execute what you want to do. So you might not choose to use that target. And I think that's, you'll choose a different target, I'm sure. But
Well, that's all about it, right? So you said it was reactionary, which it was, but it could have been prevented. I mean, had they done the initial design, had they done the policies and procedures to begin with, it would have been a reactionary statement. It would have been something that could have been prevented. You know, that's what we look at. That's what we want to do when we go in, we set with the architects and try to do things. You want to do preventive measures at that point so that you don't end up with a situation like that. But it also comes down to the policies and procedures and the trainings. And the security guards, you know, who knows, had they received anything from Wells Fargo as far as how to react in such a situation. Even if they saw it coming, if they hadn't been trained, they wouldn't even know what to do. They just kind of be befuddled. They pick up the phone and call somebody, but by that time it would be too late, and you know they would already be inside the building. So, you know, I think there are multiple things to take away from an incident like this. Your policies and procedures and training, which is what we always talk about, the training. You know, you can have policies and procedures, but unless your people are properly trained to react to those policies and procedures, and it's pointless anyway, right? Because we see that all the time with companies. They'll have policies in place, but haven't trained their employees on it. So,
yeah, and I think they're trained well now.
yeah, I'm sure they are.
But it's a good point to answer your question, Jim. The answer was there was nothing that they saw that they were aware of that this event was going to happen. So is that is then, you know, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And I think it's
It's a due diligence thing.
It's an opportunity.
Yeah.
Seriously, it's a due diligence thing. I was going to ask you on their assessments. What do they cover? How well do they do them? Do they do them to the extent, because if we're talking prevention, you find your prevention right there. Because you're going to go to what if scenarios as to how these things are going to occur. Given what they do, they should have foreseen that something like this would happen at one of their facilities.
It's prevention is different than execution.
Agreed.
And so I think prevention, as I said, I think there's a lot of forward and analyzing that needs to happen for all these big companies in order to prevent a flash or smart mob. As far as the actual coup plans being in place, you know, I think all those things were done by this group. I don't review those things. I'm not their security assessor. I know the group that, and there are several groups that do security assessments for them across the enterprise. I don't know the European risk assessment group. I don't know anybody in EMEA, but in the U.S. and North America, I do, and I'm just certain that it's one of those things that just, it's a newer phenomenon, and it just never got practiced or executed, even if it existed. It's one of those, this will never happen to me.
Sure.
But after having someone steal the gold rock, I think the gold nugget, they should have known that it might happen to them. So. Well, thank you all very much. I know it's a little shorter than